Margaret woke up as dawn began casting light over the quiet countryside. Her small home, filled with furniture worn down by time, lay silent, a silence that had only grown heavier over the years. The chill seeped through the walls, but that didn't bother her. Something far more urgent weighed on her mind, her son John. For countless nights Margaret had lain awake, her thoughts swirling around him. 2 years had passed since she last saw him. 2 years without a call, a letter, or even a word. At first, she consoled herself, thinking the fast-paced city life must have kept him busy. But over time, doubt began gnawing at her heart. Neighbors would ask, "How is your son, Mrs. Margaret? When will he visit you again?" She'd always smile and say he was just busy, though the truth weighed on her like a shadow. Dressed in her best a brown wool skirt and a blouse she had saved for special occasions, Margaret finally made a decision. She couldn't bear another sleepless night or another day of heavy silence. If John wouldn't come to her, she would go to him. John was her only child, the one she had raised alone, working from dawn till dusk after her husband passed away. She couldn't let him disappear without knowing the truth. Was he caught up in something that kept him away? Or was there something darker behind his silence? With a small suitcase in hand, Margaret left her home, closing the door with a heavy heart. The journey to the city wasn't far in distance, but emotionally it felt endless. She boarded the old bus to her destination, choosing a seat by the window. As the familiar fields faded in the distance, memories surfaced of waving goodbye to John when he had first left for the city, full of dreams and promises. Promises. John had promised to return, had promised that his success would also be hers. But now, after so many years of silence, those memories only filled Margaret with a deep, aching sadness. As the hours passed, the familiar countryside transformed into towering grey buildings that loomed against the sky. The city was loud, chaotic, and utterly foreign to her. The endless noise of traffic, the rush of people, and the glaring lights made her feel small, like a stranger in a place she didn't belong. But she pushed forward. John was here, and she had come to find him. Upon arriving at the bus station, Margaret felt dwarfed by the sea of people flowing past without a glance. She dug through her bag and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, the one with John's address scribbled on it. She had kept it since his last letter, holding on to it like a lifeline. The address was in one of the city's most exclusive areas, a place she had never dreamed of visiting. She hailed a taxi, and as they wound through the luxurious streets, Margaret stared out the window in awe. The enormous houses stood like silent fortresses, cold, spotless, and seemingly devoid of life. She remembered John's promise. "One day I'll bring you to live with me in the city, where everything is easier and more comfortable." But Margaret had never wanted to leave her humble countryside life. All she'd ever wished for was John's happiness, even if it meant being far from him. Finally, the taxi pulled up to an imposing mansion. The wrought-iron gates and perfectly manicured gardens exuded an air of intimidation. Margaret's hands trembled as she paid the driver and stepped out. She could feel the weight of the luxury surrounding her, as if even the house itself judged her presence. With a deep breath, she mustered her courage and rang the bell. Several minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. At last, the door opened, revealing a young woman dressed elegantly, her beauty as cold as the marble pillars behind her. When her gaze met Margaret's, a flash of surprise and perhaps disdain flickered across her face. "Yes?" the woman asked, her tone laced with indifference. I'm Margaret, John's mother," Margaret stammered, her voice trembling. The woman's face remained expressionless, showing neither a smile nor a warm greeting. "John isn't home," she replied curtly. "He's very busy with his business." Margaret's heart sank, the disappointment washing over her. The unease in Margaret's heart intensified, but she didn't let herself be intimidated. She had come all the way from the countryside with a broken heart to see her son, and she wasn't going to leave so easily. "I've come from far away to see him. I can wait until he returns," she said, her voice calm despite the storm of emotions churning inside. The woman, who introduced herself as Catherine, looked at Margaret with irritation and thinly veiled disdain. After an uncomfortable silence, Catherine finally relented, and motioned for Margaret to follow her into a small sitting room near the entrance. The mansion's opulence was overwhelming, a stark contrast to Margaret's simple, humble presence, but she remained steady. All she wanted was to know where her son was and why he had kept this life and his marriage from her. Margaret braced herself for what would likely be a long wait. She settled into a sofa that looked pristine, as if no one had ever used it, but a growing sense of dread began to creep over her. The silence in the house was unnerving. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. As she sat in the vast, luxurious living room, Margaret glanced around, taking in her surroundings. The room was filled with expensive paintings on the walls and heavy velvet curtains that draped to the floor, almost as if they were concealing secrets behind them. Despite the grandeur, something felt hollow about the space, as though the house itself lacked warmth or life. Shifting uncomfortably on the stiff leather sofa, she listened to its creak beneath her weight, feeling more out of place with each passing minute. Still, her love for John gave her strength. She hadn't come all this way to turn back, without understanding why her son had drifted away. Margaret's eyes searched the room, hoping to find some sign of John's presence, a photo, a keepsake, anything that might reassure her that she was truly welcome in his life. Margaret scanned the room, searching for anything that would confirm John's presence in the home, a photo, a personal item, something to make her feel he truly lived there. But there was nothing. Not a single picture of him, no trace of his belongings. It was as if the mansion held nothing of him at all. Several minutes passed before Catherine returned, her expression as cold and distant as before. She carried a cup of tea, placing it in front of Margaret on the low table. "Here, to warm you up," she said indifferently. "Thank you, dear," Margaret replied softly, trying to break the barrier between them. "When do you think John will be back? I'm so eager to see him." Catherine seated herself in a nearby chair, crossing her legs with a poised elegance that seemed almost rehearsed. Her eyes scanned Margaret's small, weary frame, taking in every detail of her humble appearance. "John is very busy these days," Catherine said smoothly. "His business consumes all his time. Sometimes he doesn't even come home at night. He's always traveling, closing important deals. He's a very sought-after man." Margaret nodded slowly, but Catherine's words left her feeling unsettled. This didn't sound like the John she knew. Her son had always been hard-working, yes, but he had also been loving and attentive. The John she knew would never have left his mother in silence for so long, much less without a single word or message. Every word Catherine spoke seemed to carry a layer of coldness, as if there was something she was hiding. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "When do you think I'll be able to see him?" she pressed, her voice firmer this time. Catherine hesitated for a moment, then stood up abruptly. "I don't know," she replied, her tone clipped. "It could be days, maybe even weeks. His schedule is unpredictable." She paused, glancing at Margaret with a slight frown. "But if you'd like, you're welcome to stay here until he returns." Without waiting for a response, Catherine turned and left the room, leaving Margaret alone in the vast empty space. Margaret watched her disappear, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Once again, silence filled the room, wrapping Margaret in a cocoon of doubt and unanswered questions. As time passed slowly, the light streaming through the mansion's grand windows shifted, casting long shadows across the walls. As the sun set, the windows began to darken, casting the room in hues of orange and gold. Seconds stretched into hours as Margaret sat, waiting anxiously for any news of her son. The tea Catherine had brought her sat untouched, long gone cold. Her stomach was too unsettled to eat or drink anything. The silence in the mansion became almost oppressive, an uneasy stillness that seemed to close in around her. Every creak of wood, every faint murmur from the distant staff echoed in her mind, intensifying her growing dread. Her mother's instinct screamed that something was wrong, that behind Catherine's cold demeanor lay secrets she wasn't willing to share. From time to time, the house staff moved past her, their footsteps quick, and their eyes averted as if they wanted to avoid her entirely. They were like shadows, slipping silently from one room to the next, adding to the sense of isolation that filled Margaret's heart. No one acknowledged her presence, not a smile, not even a glance of sympathy. She felt like an outsider in her own son's life. As darkness fully enveloped the house, Catherine reappeared in the doorway, her expression as distant as ever. She offered no explanations, no comforting words, only a blank, emotionless look. "It's late, Mrs. Margaret," she said flatly. "I'll have Alfred, our butler, show you to a room where you can rest. It may be several days before John returns." Margaret stood, nodding slowly, though her heart was tangled with uncertainty. She wanted to ask more questions, to understand what was happening, but something in Catherine's unyielding demeanor told her that no answers would be given tonight. John's wife had built an impenetrable wall around herself, and Margaret knew she couldn't break through it, not now at least. Alfred, the butler, appeared at the door, an older man with a face etched by time and a cautious, restrained expression. He gestured for Margaret to follow him, leading her silently through the mansion's dim hallways. As they walked, Margaret noticed that Alfred, like the rest of the staff, avoided making eye contact, but there was something in his demeanor, an almost imperceptible sadness, that made her wonder if he knew more than he let on. Margaret sensed Alfred knew more than he was letting on. He led her to a small room far from the heart of the mansion. It was a simple guest room, but to Margaret it was more than enough. She was exhausted physically and emotionally. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she listened as Alfred's footsteps faded down the hall, leaving her in silence once again. It was a silence that seemed to press down heavily on her heart. Just before Alfred closed the door, Margaret called out, a question that had been pressing on her mind since her arrival. "Excuse me, Alfred, is it?" she asked softly. "Do you know when my son will be back?" Alfred hesitated, his face momentarily filled with uncertainty. Finally, he nodded slightly, avoiding her gaze. "Your son, John. It's complicated, Mrs. Margaret. He's very busy," he replied, and without another word, he closed the door behind him. Alfred's words echoed in Margaret's mind, unsettling her even more. The same empty reassurances Catherine had given, but with a tone that hinted at something deeper, something unsaid. What were they hiding? Margaret lay down on the small bed, closing her eyes, but sleep would not come. Her thoughts were filled with John. He was somewhere perhaps closer than she imagined, but wrapped in a mystery that no one seemed willing to explain. What was Catherine hiding, and why did everyone avoid speaking directly about him? As her thoughts swirled, Margaret made a silent vow. She would not leave this mansion until she uncovered the truth about her son. Something was wrong. She felt it in her bones. The first ray of sunlight slipped through the heavy curtains as Margaret opened her eyes after a restless night, her resolve stronger than ever. Restless dreams and emotional exhaustion weighed heavily on Margaret's body, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Despite Catherine's insistence that John was away on business, Margaret's heart told her otherwise. There was something in this mansion that didn't fit, something everyone around her seemed to be hiding. She rose slowly, feeling the cold floor beneath her bare feet. Dressed in the same clothes she had brought from the countryside, she made her decision. It was time to confront Catherine, hoping that perhaps she would finally give her some concrete news about John. As she walked through the long hallways, the absolute silence seemed to press against her. The house staff moved like shadows, silently passing between rooms without speaking a word to her, not even acknowledging her presence. The coldness of the mansion wrapped around her like an invisible shroud, and the isolation she felt grew heavier with every step. When Margaret reached the dining room, she found the grand table completely empty. There was no sign of Catherine or any other family member. Only a few servants moved about, setting out an extravagant breakfast that seemed out of place in a house so devoid of warmth. The spread before her seemed like it was meant for a celebration, not the loneliness that clung to the mansion's walls. Margaret sat slowly at the table, uncomfortable with the lavish surroundings. She decided to wait, hoping Catherine would appear soon with answers, but minutes turned into hours. Catherine never came. The mansion, despite its size, felt strangely empty. The sense of abandonment that had begun to grow in Margaret's chest deepened. The servants moved quickly, avoiding her gaze every time they passed by. Not a single kind word was exchanged, not even a courteous gesture. It was as if they were afraid of her. Afraid she might ask something, or worse, disrupt the cold, controlled routine Catherine had imposed on the house. After finishing what little she had managed to eat, Margaret decided to walk through the mansion. Something inside her urged her to explore, to uncover what was really happening. She needed to find a clue, anything that might reveal where John was and why everything seemed so wrong. As she wandered through the house, she came across several locked doors which struck her as odd. In a house this large, why would there be so many rooms that no one was allowed to enter? Every time she tried to approach one of these doors, a servant would appear as if they were watching her, offering an excuse to lead her away from the area. It was becoming clear that there was something, or someone, hidden behind those doors. In one of the farthest hallways of the mansion, near an area that seemed reserved for the staff, Margaret saw Alfred, the butler. He was bent over, cleaning an old table, but when he noticed her presence, he stopped. His eyes filled with a mixture of concern and caution, lingering on her for a second too long. "Alfred," Margaret called, approaching slowly. The man looked up, and though he seemed uncomfortable, he didn't avoid her like the others. "Mrs. Margaret," he responded in a deep voice. "Where is my son?" she asked directly, her voice filled with urgency. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine. Alfred tensed up as if her question had placed him in a dangerous situation. He glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. "Hatida," he began, but then fell silent as if struggling with his words. "It's not my place to say." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She realized then that Alfred knew something important, but for some reason he couldn't reveal it right now. Still, her intuition told her that he held the key to uncovering the truth about what was really going on in this house. "If it's not your place, then whose is it?" Margaret replied, trying to stay calm despite the rising panic in her chest. "My son is all I have, and something tells me you're not telling me the whole truth." Alfred looked away, clearly troubled by the situation. But before he could say anything more, a sound in the hallway alerted him. Catherine appeared in the doorway, her cold presence filling the room. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her tense smile revealing little warmth. She glanced between Margaret and Alfred, who immediately resumed his work without another word. Margaret felt Catherine's gaze weigh heavily on her, but she said nothing. She knew she had to be cautious for now. Nodding slightly, she turned and left the room, heading back to the main hall. Later, as the afternoon wore on, Margaret decided to approach Alfred again. She knew he was her only silent ally in this house, but she also knew he was trapped. The questions that burned in her chest wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth. Footsteps were soft on the cold marble floor as she moved through the dark corridors. Each turn she made felt like a step closer to uncovering something she had long feared. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, but she refused to turn back. As she passed by the rooms, Margaret's heart beat faster. The house seemed alive with secrets, its walls holding whispers she couldn't hear but could feel with every breath she took. She moved with purpose, trying to ignore the sharp sense of unease that gripped her, knowing that her son, her John, was hidden somewhere within these walls, and she needed to find him. She reached a hallway where the walls seemed less decorated, more utilitarian, just rooms, doors, and silence. The doors were all locked, just as they had been before, but one door, at the very end of the hallway, was slightly ajar. It wasn't locked. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded louder, the sound of it filling her ears. This was the moment she had been waiting for. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open slowly, careful not to make any noise. The room was dark, but there was a faint smell of medical supplies and something else, something sterile, clinical. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The room was sparsely furnished with only a bed, a dresser, and a few chairs. It looked like a room meant to be lived in, but never truly used. And then she saw him. John was lying in bed, his face pale and drawn, his eyes closed. His once vibrant appearance had been replaced by a ghostly stillness. His arm was in a cast and his body was wrapped in bandages, though it seemed like he hadn't moved in weeks. His injuries were serious, But what shocked Margaret the most was the unnatural stillness around him, the silence, the way he seemed disconnected from the world. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She rushed to his side, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his cheek. He was cold to the touch, and her heart broke at the sight of him in such a state. "John," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What happened to you? What did they do to you?" John didn't respond. His eyes remained closed, as if the world outside no longer existed for him. The only sound was the soft beeping of a heart monitor nearby, a small reminder that he was still alive, but barely. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. Alfred's words rang in her ears. John had an accident months ago. Catherine hasn't allowed anyone to see him. She keeps him hidden. Why? Why had Catherine kept him hidden all this time? Why hadn't she told Margaret the truth? It was clear now that something much darker was going on in this house. Margaret's gaze shifted around the room, looking for any clue, any answer. She saw a few scattered papers on the desk and some unopened letters, but nothing that seemed to explain the gravity of what had happened to her son. Before she could investigate further, she heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Her heart stopped. She quickly backed away from John's bed, her chest tight with fear. The door to the room was still ajar, and she knew that if Catherine or anyone else found her here, it would be all over. Margaret rushed to the door, her body tense as the footsteps grew louder. She could feel the cold presence of the house closing in on her, the walls pressing in as she scrambled to find a way out of this nightmare. With a final glance at her son, she closed the door softly and retreated down the hallway, her thoughts racing. She had found him. John was here. But the truth was even darker than she had feared. She couldn't leave him here, hidden away. She couldn't leave without answers. Margaret had come for her son, but now she knew that nothing in this mansion would let her leave without confronting the full, terrifying truth. Alfred hesitated, his face shadowed by the weight of his words. He glanced down the hallway, ensuring they were still alone, then stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your son," he began, "wasn't just in an accident. It wasn't a simple fall or a car crash. The truth is, he's not the same anymore. Not physically, not mentally. He was hurt badly, in ways I can't even begin to describe. But Catherine, she refuses to let anyone see him. She's keeping him hidden, locked away. She says it's for his own good, but..." Alfred paused, swallowing hard, clearly struggling with the weight of what he was about to say. "But she's changed, Mrs. Margaret. She's not the woman you knew. She's become someone else, someone cold, unrecognizable. And I fear she's doing things that aren't right." Margaret's heart clenched, her mind spinning with the implications of his words. Her son, the child she had raised with love and care, was no longer the same. The words "not the same anymore" echoed in her mind, a dreadful realization sinking in. She pressed him further, her voice trembling but determined. "What do you mean, Alfred? What exactly happened to him?" Alfred looked pained, glancing over his shoulder again before speaking in a hushed tone. "I don't know all the details, Mum, but I know that after the accident, John wasn't just physically hurt. Catherine, she took control. She refused medical help. She isolated him. She's been changing him, making him more compliant. She doesn't let him interact with anyone, and she's kept everything about him locked away, even his condition. It's all a secret. Only Catherine knows the full extent, and she's never let anyone else close. We all have our suspicions, but we can't do anything without crossing her. She has everyone in this house under her control." Margaret felt as though the ground beneath her feet was slipping away. Her son, the man she had once known, might be locked away in that very mansion, altered beyond recognition. She had to know what had happened, what Catherine was hiding. She couldn't let her son remain a prisoner in his own life. "I have to see him, Alfred," she said, her voice growing firm despite the overwhelming fear rising inside her. "I can't leave without knowing the truth. I have to speak with him. Please tell me where he is." Alfred's face grew darker, and he lowered his voice even further. "It's not safe for you to do that. Catherine will do everything in her power to stop you. But I'll help you, Mrs. Margaret. I'll show you where he's been kept. You have to be careful. She's watching everything. If she catches you trying to see him, it could be worse for both of you." Margaret nodded resolutely, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come this far, there was no turning back now. She had to see her son, even if it meant defying Catherine and risking everything. Alfred motioned for her to follow him, and together they moved quietly down the darkened hallway, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the heavy silence that surrounded them. Every creak of the old house felt like a warning, but Margaret didn't hesitate. She had one goal now, to find John and to bring him home no matter the cost. "Mrs. Margaret," Alfred whispered, his face filled with concern. "I understand your desperation, but you don't know what you're up against. Catherine's not just protective of John, she's controlling him in ways that we can't even begin to comprehend. She's convinced everyone that she's doing what's best for him, but no one has seen him for months. Even the staff is too afraid to speak out. If you go after him now, there's no telling what she might do." Margaret's chest tightened as she absorbed Alfred's words. The reality of the situation was even darker than she had feared. Her son, her beloved John, was not only hidden away, but trapped in a way that felt almost unnatural. Catherine's control over him and over everything in the house was suffocating. The idea that a once loving woman could transform into someone so cold and manipulative sent a wave of shock through Margaret. But there was no turning back now. She couldn't leave without seeing her son, without knowing the truth of what had happened to him. "I don't care what Catherine will do," Margaret said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "She's kept him from me for far too long. I'm his mother. I have a right to see him. I'm not leaving until I do." Alfred hesitated, torn between his loyalty to Margaret and his fear of Catherine. After a long moment, he finally nodded, his face grim. "I'll help you," he said quietly, "but we have to be careful. Catherine's not the woman you knew. She's capable of anything to keep you away from John. I'll take you to him, but we need to move fast." Margaret's heart raced with a mixture of relief and fear. For the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, she felt like she might finally get the answers she so desperately needed. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice steady now. Alfred glanced around again to make sure no one was watching, then motioned for Margaret to follow him. He led her through the winding hallways of the mansion, past the luxurious but coldly empty rooms, their silence serving as a constant reminder of the distance between her and the son she had once known. They reached a remote part of the house, quiet, far removed from the main areas, and Alfred stopped in front of a door, its wood darkened with age and wear. He turned to Margaret, his expression heavy. "He's in there," he said softly, "but you have to be prepared. What you see, it might not be what you expect." Margaret nodded, steeling herself. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she grasped the cold doorknob, and slowly, with a deep breath, she opened the door. She was determined to find out. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but every new piece seemed to raise more questions. What kind of accident had John suffered? How had Catherine changed so completely, becoming so cold and manipulative? What was she hiding? The answers were out there, and Margaret was getting closer to finding them. That morning, as the soft light of dawn filtered through the heavy curtains, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The mansion, despite its grandeur, felt more like a prison than ever before. She had come here searching for her son, and now, more than ever, she was resolved to uncover the truth no matter the cost. Margaret rose from the bed, her steps quiet and deliberate. The house, still silent, seemed to watch her, as if aware of her growing resolve. She dressed quickly, preparing for what lay ahead. She could feel the weight of the challenge ahead, but she wouldn't let fear hold her back. Alfred's words echoed in her mind, "Be careful." She couldn't afford to rush, but the time to act was coming. She had to be patient, wait for Catherine to leave. And when she did, she would make her move. She would find Olivia, speak with her, and learn everything she could about what had happened to John. The minutes stretched out like hours, the house still quiet, each moment filled with anticipation. Margaret sat by the window, watching the rising sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt hollow, overshadowed by the secrets that lurked within the mansion's walls. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Margaret heard the sound of a car pulling out of the driveway. Catherine was leaving. Alfred had said the timing was crucial, and now it was time to act. Margaret slipped from her room, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved quickly and quietly through the house, remembering Alfred's instructions. She reached the back garden, where Alfred had promised to meet her when the moment was right. As she stepped outside, the cool morning air filled her lungs, giving her a brief moment of clarity. But the calm was short-lived. She was about to step deeper into the unknown, and there was no turning back now. She glanced around, looking for any sign of Alfred or Olivia. Everything was quiet, the garden bathed in the soft morning light. Then, just as she had been told, a figure emerged from the shadows. Alfred. He was careful, cautious, but he nodded to her. "This way," he whispered, leading her toward the narrow side of the house where a small service entrance was hidden. Margaret followed, her heart beating faster with every step. "Not the man he used to be," Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's changed. Ever since the accident, he's been different. The fall. It was bad, worse than Catherine let on. But it's not just physical. It's as if part of him was taken with it. Something inside him is not the same." Margaret's heart sank. She had feared it, but hearing it out loud, especially from someone so close to John, made the reality hit harder. "What do you mean? What happened to him? Why is he hidden away like this?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Olivia hesitated, her gaze darting around the small, dimly lit room, as if ensuring they weren't being overheard. "It wasn't an accident," she finally said, her voice trembling. "At least that's what some of the staff believe. There are rumors. Some say that John didn't fall, that he was pushed. It's all so tangled, Miss Margaret. But whatever happened, John has been left in a state where he can't function the way he used to. Catherine keeps him in the far wing, heavily sedated, barely conscious most of the time." Margaret's mind reeled. Her son, her strong, capable John, was being kept in that condition, sedated, hidden from the world, and now she was hearing that it might not have even been an accident. The shock was almost too much to bear, but she had to keep pushing, had to understand everything, no matter how painful. "Why is she doing this?" Margaret's voice cracked as she pressed further. "Why keep him locked away like this? What is she hiding?" Olivia swallowed hard, her face twisted in discomfort. "I don't know all the details, but Catherine, she's been running things for months now, taking control of John's business, his life. It's as if she wants to erase him, to take everything for herself. No one is allowed to see him, not even the doctor she hired to care for him. And God help anyone who asks too many questions. She's changed, Miss Margaret. There's something dark about her now." Margaret could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't break down now. "I need to see him," she said firmly. "I need to know that he's still in there. I can't just leave him like this. Please help me." Olivia took a deep breath, clearly torn. "I don't know if it's safe, Miss Margaret. Catherine has eyes everywhere and she's paranoid. But there might be a way. It's dangerous, but I can try to help you get to him. I can sneak you into his room when Catherine leaves the house again. But you need to be careful. She'll notice if anything is out of place." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. "I don't care about the danger," she said, her voice steady now, filled with the fierce determination of a mother. "I need to see my son. I'll do whatever it takes." Olivia hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "All right. I'll make sure to find a time when Catherine's gone. But you have to promise me you'll be careful. If she finds out—" "I will be careful," Margaret reassured her. "I promise." Olivia gave her a final long look of concern before opening the door slightly to check the hallway. "Stay hidden until I give the signal," she whispered urgently. "You have to wait for the right moment." Margaret nodded, her heart heavy but determined. As Olivia closed the door behind her, Margaret stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, her pulse racing. She was close, so close, to finding out the truth, and nothing, not even the danger, would stop her from reaching John. calculating, cold demeanor, and her sudden takeover of John's life made it clear that she had been planning this for a long time. Her son, the love of her life, was being poisoned, his strength sapped, his will broken, all for control, for power, for wealth. The idea that Catherine could do this, could betray him in such a brutal, calculated way, was unthinkable. Yet as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became undeniable. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to process the horror Olivia had just revealed. John was fighting for his life, slowly being destroyed by the very person who should have loved and protected him. The weight of the betrayal was suffocating, and the rage that boiled up inside Margaret was as fierce as the love she felt for her son. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. "I have to stop her," Margaret whispered, her voice cold and determined. "I will not let her get away with this. I will not let her hurt John any longer." Olivia looked at Margaret with a mix of fear and pity. "You have to be careful, Miss Margaret. If Catherine finds out what you know, she'll stop at nothing to protect herself. She's dangerous, and so is her brother. They'll do anything to cover their tracks." Margaret's heart was pounding in her chest, but her mind was focused. "I don't care. I've already lost so much. John is all I have left, and I'm not going to lose him to her." Olivia's eyes softened. "Then we need to act quickly. We can't let her keep John locked away like this. You need to see him to get him out of here before she finishes what she started. But you must be cautious. There's no time to waste, but there's no room for mistakes." Margaret nodded firmly, her resolve stronger than ever. The mansion that had once seemed so grand and beautiful now felt like a prison, and every shadow in the hallways was a reminder of the cruelty lurking within its walls. But she was no longer afraid. Her love for John, her need to protect him, had given her strength. "I'll do whatever it takes," Margaret said, her voice steady and full of purpose. "I'll find a way to get to John, and I'll make sure Catherine pays for what she's done." Olivia nodded, her face a mixture of relief and anxiety. "I'll help you. I'll get the timing right, but we must be careful. If we move too soon or too recklessly, it could all fall apart." "I trust you," Margaret replied, her eyes burning with the fire of determination. "Just tell me what to do and I'll be ready." Olivia placed a hand on Margaret's arm, her touch a brief moment of comfort in the midst of the storm that was about to come. "We'll do this together. Stay hidden, keep your distance from Catherine, and we'll find a way to save John." As the two women exchanged a final look of understanding, the gravity of what lay ahead weighed heavily on them both. The mansion that had once seemed like a place of wealth and luxury now felt like a dark, suffocating trap. But Margaret would stop at nothing to uncover the truth and save her son, no matter what it took. Olivia's eyes filled with both fear and determination as she met Margaret's gaze. She knew the risks of what they were about to attempt, but she also understood that if they didn't act, they would lose John forever. The shadow of Catherine's control over the house was suffocating, but Margaret's unwavering resolve had given Olivia the strength to push forward. "I'll do it," Olivia said quietly, her voice low with resolve. "I'll get the samples to a trusted doctor, but we need to be careful. Catherine is always watching. She knows more than she lets on." Margaret nodded, squeezing Olivia's hands tightly. "We can't wait. I'll keep her distracted, give you the time you need, but you have to hurry. Every minute counts." The weight of their plan settled heavily between them, and yet, for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, Margaret felt a spark of hope. They had a chance. There was a way out of this nightmare, but the stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was looming over them both. Olivia glanced around the room one last time before stepping back. "I'll do what I can, but please be careful, Mrs. Margaret. Once we have the proof, we can take it to the authorities. But until then, we have to stay hidden. One wrong move and everything could fall apart." "I understand," Margaret replied, her voice firm despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "We'll make it through this, Olivia. We have to." As the nurse quietly left the room, Margaret remained behind, her mind spinning with all the risks ahead. The mansion had never felt colder, more oppressive than in that moment. Catherine's influence, her manipulative control over every part of John's life, was like a dark cloud hanging over them. But Margaret refused to give in. She paced the room, her thoughts a whirlwind of strategy and fear. The confrontation with Catherine was inevitable, but it had to be at the right moment, after they had the proof, after they were certain they could expose the truth without putting John's life in even more danger. As night fell over the mansion once again, Margaret knew that the time to act was drawing near. The pieces of their plan were starting to fall into place, but it would take everything she had to make it work. With a deep breath, she steeled herself for the fight ahead. Tomorrow would be the day that everything changed, slipping away, and every passing moment felt like a countdown. The mansion, with its cold walls and secrets lurking in every corner, no longer felt like a place of refuge. It was a prison for John, and soon Margaret realized for herself too if they weren't careful. "I've been thinking," Alfred whispered, pulling her aside as he glanced cautiously down the hallway. "Catherine's leaving again tomorrow. She'll be out for a few hours, and that might be our chance. I can help you get to John's room, get you closer to where she keeps him locked away." Margaret's heart quickened at the thought. "But how do we get past the guards or the nurse? Catherine will notice if anyone goes near him." Alfred hesitated, then looked her in the eye. "Olivia can help with that. I'll take care of the rest. We'll create a diversion, something that'll pull Catherine's attention away, even if just for a moment. But you'll have to be quick. Get in, see John, and if you can, bring back something from his room that'll prove the poison." Margaret took a deep breath. It sounded risky, too risky. But her instincts told her this was the only way to save John, to finally expose Catherine's lies. And in her heart, she knew there was no other option. "We can do this," Margaret said, her voice low but filled with resolve. "I'll do my part, you do yours, we'll get the proof. And once we have it, we go to the authorities." Alfred gave a curt nod. "I'll start making arrangements, but be careful, Mrs. Margaret. Catherine has eyes everywhere, and her temper, well, you don't want to see it when she's crossed." Margaret smiled faintly. "I've seen enough of her to know just how dangerous she can be." The next morning everything felt tense, charged with a sense of impending action. Catherine had left the mansion, leaving only a few servants behind to carry on the usual routine. Alfred moved quickly, coordinating with Olivia and Margaret to set the stage for the operation. Margaret's pulse raced as she prepared for the confrontation, every step in the mansion feeling like it could be her last. She knew Catherine would never forgive her for this, but she wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions anymore. When the time finally came, Alfred's diversion went off without a hitch. The staff was momentarily distracted by a small fire in one of the kitchen fireplaces, allowing Margaret the window of time she needed to slip away unnoticed. She moved quickly, her heart pounding in her chest as she navigated the maze of corridors that led to John's room. She reached the door that had been so carefully locked, and for a moment her mind went blank with fear. What would she find on the other side? Would John even recognize her? Would Catherine be waiting for her, ready to catch her in the act? With a steadying breath, Margaret opened the door. Mansion, hidden away in the shadows of its lavish rooms. Catherine had kept her private life well guarded, but Margaret was certain there were cracks, small details, old documents, or forgotten memories that could unravel the dark truth. With Alfred's warnings echoing in her mind, Margaret moved carefully through the house, avoiding the staff as they went about their duties. She couldn't afford to raise suspicion. The mansion's vast corridors felt like a labyrinth, each turn an obstacle that might lead her deeper into Catherine's web of deceit. She knew the library was where Catherine kept her personal affairs bank statements, legal papers, perhaps something that would give her the ammunition she needed. Margaret had seen Catherine retreat there frequently, but today the room was eerily quiet. She hesitated outside the door, glancing over her shoulder. The house was still, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The library was just as it always had been, quiet, filled with rows upon rows of books that hid secrets behind their spines. Margaret began to search, starting with the desk at the far end of the room. She knew she didn't have much time before someone came to check on her, but every drawer, every folder felt crucial. Minutes seemed to stretch into hours, and just as Margaret was about to give up, she found it. A leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of papers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She opened it carefully, scanning the pages for anything that might explain Catherine's recent actions. As she flipped through, one entry caught her eye. "The business is mine now. John's weakness will be his undoing and no one can stop me. William has agreed to help. We'll make sure he doesn't recover. The inheritance will be mine and no one will question it." Margaret's hands trembled as she read the words. There it was, the confirmation she needed. Catherine had been planning her husband's demise for far longer than Margaret had realized. It was all about control and power. Her thoughts raced, but she knew she couldn't let this slip. She carefully closed the journal, making sure no one would be able to trace it back to her. Just as she was about to leave the library, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Her heart raced. There was no time to put the journal back. Thinking quickly, Margaret tucked the journal into her coat and exited the room, moving swiftly toward the nearest stairwell. As she descended, she could hear the muffled sound of voices in the distance. Catherine, William. They were probably discussing their next move, and Margaret knew she needed to act fast before they caught wind of her discovery. She hurried back to her room, her pulse racing. She had the evidence now, but she still needed more. She couldn't take down Catherine with just this journal. The truth was still buried beneath layers of lies and deceit, but for the first time in days, Margaret felt a spark of hope. She had the power to expose Catherine, to save John from the poison that was slowly killing him, but she couldn't do it alone. She needed Olivia's help, and Alfred. Together, they would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. Margaret's pulse quickened as she carefully pulled the file from the drawer. The gold lettering on the cover gleamed under the faint light from the window, but the weight of what she was holding felt much heavier than its physical form. This file could hold the key to exposing Catherine's plans, but Margaret knew she had to proceed with caution. Any mistake could endanger not just her, but also Olivia and Alfred. With a deep breath, she opened the file, flipping through the pages. At first glance, it seemed to contain nothing more than ordinary documents, birth certificates, marriage records, and business dealings. But then something caught her eye. A set of photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. There were images of a younger Catherine standing beside a man Margaret didn't recognize, but the expressions on their faces were anything but joyful. They were scheming, their eyes filled with a cold determination. The photos were taken in various locations, some in dark, secluded spaces, others in what appeared to be hidden rooms of the mansion. As Margaret sifted through them, she came across something that made her blood run cold: photos of John, lying in a hospital bed looking pale and frail. But what was most chilling was the date on one of the photographs. It was taken only a few weeks ago. Her heart dropped into her stomach. These weren't just casual family snapshots. These were part of a larger plan, a deliberate manipulation of John's condition. Margaret's hands shook as she flipped through more pages in the file. Some were medical reports, but the handwriting on them wasn't from any doctor Margaret knew. It was Catherine's own scrawl, noting John's decline, his worsening condition, and how they needed to keep him from getting better. Margaret's mind raced. This was it. This was the evidence that could prove Catherine's true intentions. But there was more. As she continued, she came across a financial statement that detailed large sums of money being transferred to a numbered offshore account, an account that Catherine and William had access to. The money was being funneled into it under the guise of business expenses, but Margaret knew it was no coincidence. This was part of Catherine's plan to seize everything John had worked for. Margaret closed the file with trembling hands. The truth was right in front of her, but now she had to figure out how to use it without tipping off Catherine. The sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway sent a jolt of panic through her. She couldn't risk being caught here, not now, not with this crucial evidence. With one last glance at the file, Margaret quickly slipped it back into the drawer and locked the door behind her. Her heart pounded as she moved quietly through the hallway, her thoughts consumed by the danger that loomed over her and John. She had to act fast. When Margaret returned to her room, she wasted no time. She carefully hid the file under the floorboards, out of sight, knowing that Catherine would stop at nothing to keep her secrets hidden. But now that Margaret had the truth, she knew she had to bring it to light. She immediately went to find Alfred. Time was running out, and the only way to stop Catherine was to expose her to the world. Least Margaret now had a powerful piece of the puzzle. She couldn't let it slip through her fingers. Catherine had been systematically eliminating her husbands to secure their fortunes, and John was next in line, her own son, her flesh and blood. It was unthinkable, but now it made sense. The coldness, the secrecy, the way Catherine controlled every aspect of John's life, and the slow decline in his health, it all pointed to the same monstrous pattern. Margaret took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She couldn't let her emotions take over now. Her son needed her, and she had to be methodical in her approach. The file in her hands was a start, but without tangible proof of the poisoning, it would be difficult to bring anyone to justice. She needed to find a way to expose Catherine's plan without alerting her, without giving her a chance to cover her tracks. She stood up, carefully placing the file back in the drawer. The weight of what she had discovered pressed down on her chest, but she couldn't afford to waste any time. Olivia had already been collecting samples of the medication, and with any luck, they would be able to prove John was being poisoned. That was their key to stopping Catherine. Once they had irrefutable evidence, they could take it to the authorities, and Catherine's reign of terror would be over. As she quietly closed the office door behind her, Margaret's thoughts raced. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of fear. Catherine was dangerous, more dangerous than Margaret had ever imagined. If Catherine found out what she was doing, she might act out of desperation. But Margaret had no choice. She couldn't back down now. The next few days would be crucial. Olivia's work was nearing completion, and the pieces were falling into place. But Margaret knew it wasn't just the poison they needed to expose. They had to show how deep Catherine's manipulation went, how she had orchestrated every detail of John's downfall. This wasn't just about saving her son. It was about making sure Catherine would never hurt anyone again. With the file in hand, she made her way back to her room, her mind set on what had to be done. No matter what came next, Margaret was determined to fight for John. She had uncovered the truth, and she wouldn't let it be buried again. And William had been working together all along, meticulously orchestrating their scheme to seize everything John had built. The forged signatures, the hidden money transfers, it was all a web of deceit meant to strip John of his wealth and control, ensuring that once he was gone, they would inherit everything. Margaret's hands trembled as she read through the documents, her heart pounding in her chest. She had suspected something was off, but seeing it laid out so clearly in front of her made her stomach churn. John had been kept weak and bedridden, unable to defend himself, while Catherine and William took advantage of his condition to ruin him financially and prepare for his inevitable death. The thought that John's illness and the manipulations of his own wife and brother-in-law were all part of a larger, sinister plan made Margaret's blood boil. She couldn't let them get away with this. She had the proof now, the documents, the forged signatures, the money trail, it was all there. But she couldn't afford to be caught. She knew Catherine and William wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. With a sense of urgency, Margaret gathered the incriminating documents into her bag. As she closed the file drawers, she noticed a strange folder tucked under a pile of papers. This one wasn't like the others. It was marked with a red stamp. Confidential. Margaret's curiosity got the better of her, and she pulled it out, her heart racing. Inside the folder were more details about the financial dealings, but there was something else. A series of emails between William and a third party, someone she didn't recognize. The emails were discussing the final stages of John's treatment, mentioning that it was time for the last phase to begin. Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized the implication. The poisoning was no accident. It had been planned from the start. John's illness wasn't just a result of bad luck or an unfortunate fall. They had been slowly killing him, and now they were preparing for the final blow. Margaret stuffed the folder into her bag, her mind racing. She couldn't waste another second. She had the evidence now, proof of the poisoning, the forged signatures, the financial conspiracy. She had everything she needed to expose Catherine and William for who they truly were. But the danger was far from over. Catherine and William would stop at nothing to protect their plan. Margaret knew she had to act quickly, and the first step was to get this evidence to the authorities before it was too late. As Margaret left William's office, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Catherine lurking in the hallway, waiting for her. But the mansion was eerily quiet, and she moved swiftly through the halls back to her room. Every step felt like it could be her last. The weight of the evidence in her bag was heavy, but it was nothing compared to the burden of knowing what was at stake. She knew now what she had to do. Margaret wasn't going to let her son die at the hands of the very people who were supposed to protect him. She had to get this evidence to the authorities and make sure Catherine and William paid for their crimes. No more hesitation. The fight for John's life had reached its final stage, and Margaret was ready to face whatever came next. "We're up to something. She'll stop at nothing to destroy us all," Olivia warned in a low voice, her gaze flickering nervously toward the door. Margaret nodded, her own anxiety rising at the thought of Catherine catching wind of their plan. But they couldn't afford to wait. Every moment John remained under Catherine's control was another moment his life was at risk. "We'll keep our movements as quiet as possible," Margaret said, her voice tight with determination. "I'm counting on you, Olivia. You're the only one who can help him now." Olivia smiled faintly, though her exhaustion was evident. "I won't let her win, Mrs. Margaret. I'll do everything I can." As Margaret left the meeting, she felt a mix of hope and dread. They were so close to bringing Catherine's cruelty into the light. But there were still so many risks. The next few days would be critical, and Margaret had to stay vigilant. She couldn't afford any mistakes. Back in her room she paced, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The documents in her bag seemed to weigh heavier with every passing hour. She had everything: proof of the poisoning, the forged signatures, the financial records. But without the medical proof, they were only half a step closer to saving John. As night fell, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Catherine would be aware soon enough of the changes happening around John, of Olivia's subtle attempts to provide him with better care. She had to be ready for whatever Catherine might throw at her next. Margaret's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was Alfred. "They're planning something tonight," the message read. "Be careful." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. It was the warning she'd been waiting for. Catherine and William were making their move, and she had no time to waste. She quickly gathered her things, determined to put an end to this nightmare. Whatever Catherine and William had planned, Margaret was ready to fight back. For John. For her son. She had gathered the file detailing Catherine's dark past, the forged contracts, and the financial records showing the siphoning of John's wealth was the weapon she needed. It was the proof she had been waiting for, the key to exposing the twisted conspiracy that had ensnared her son. But even with this newfound strength, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of danger lurking around every corner. Every step she took in the mansion, every glance from the staff, felt like they were all part of Catherine's watchful eye. She had to act swiftly yet cautiously to avoid giving away their plans. One evening, as Margaret was walking down the hallway to meet Alfred, she overheard voices in the distance. They were coming from the main dining room, where Catherine and William were having an argument. The words were muffled, but Margaret could make out the unmistakable tension in their tones. "I don't care if she finds out," William's voice hissed. "She's just one woman. We have the whole house under control. John is as good as dead, and once he's gone, we can move forward with the final stage of the plan." Margaret froze. The final stage. Her heart raced. They were planning something big. Whatever it was, it would mean the end for John if she didn't act. She quickly moved to the side, pressing herself against the wall to avoid being seen. Her mind was racing. What could their next move be? Was it related to the poisoning? Or had they planned something else entirely to finish John off once and for all? The sound of footsteps approached, and Margaret quickly ducked into a nearby alcove, holding her breath. She didn't want to risk being discovered. Once the coast was clear, she hurried back to her room and immediately messaged Olivia. "They're planning something?" Margaret wrote, her fingers trembling. I overheard them talking. We need to act now. Olivia's response came quickly. I know the samples will be ready soon, but we have to be prepared for anything. Stay alert, Mrs. Margaret. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. Time was running out. The moment she had feared had arrived. Catherine and William were making their move. With the evidence in her possession, and the knowledge that they were getting closer to unmasking the full extent of the conspiracy, Margaret knew she couldn't afford to wait any longer. Her son's life was at stake, and she would stop at nothing to save him. The showdown was coming, and when it did, she would face Catherine and William with everything she had, his former self. His body was frail, his skin pale, and his once vibrant eyes now clouded with exhaustion. Margaret's heart broke at the sight, but she quickly wiped her tears away, steeling herself for what needed to be done. "John," she whispered softly, her voice breaking, "we're getting you out of here. We're going to save you." John's eyes flickered slightly, as if he heard her but couldn't fully comprehend. Olivia, who had been silently preparing medical supplies in the corner, glanced at Margaret with a solemn expression. "He's weak, Mrs. Margaret," Olivia said quietly. "But we have everything ready. We just need to move quickly." Margaret nodded, taking a deep breath as she approached John's bedside. She gently took his hand, her fingers trembling as she held onto him, as though her touch could somehow bring him back to life. She could feel the warmth of his hand, though it was faint, and for a moment it gave her a surge of hope. "We're going to take you somewhere safe, John," she said softly. "I promise, just hold on." Olivia carefully administered the last of the medications that would stabilize John for the journey, but it was clear that every second counted. As Alfred had promised, the security cameras were down, and the guards at the entrance had been temporarily distracted by the malfunction. The windows of opportunity were closing fast. Once John was prepared, Alfred appeared at the door, looking both relieved and anxious. "Everything's in place," Alfred whispered urgently. "The car is waiting. We have to move now." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment they had been working toward, and they couldn't afford any delays. They had to leave the mansion behind, escape before Catherine and William returned, and before their plans could be uncovered. With Olivia supporting John on one side, and Alfred guiding them through the halls on the other, Margaret could hardly believe they were finally escaping. She couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at the grand house, the house that had once been a symbol of wealth and comfort, now a prison for her son. There would be no turning back. The journey through the mansion was tense and silent. The halls, usually filled with noise and activity, felt eerily empty now. The faint sound of their footsteps seemed to echo through the silence, amplifying their urgency. As they reached the back door, Margaret's heart leapt when she saw the black car waiting outside, the engine running, ready to whisk them away. But just as they were about to make their final dash, a noise shattered the calm. The unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the hall. A voice called out sharply, "Where are you going?" It was Catherine. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide in horror. How could she have known? How could she have returned early? Before anyone could react, Catherine appeared in the doorway, her cold, calculating gaze locking onto Margaret. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. "You thought you could just leave?" Catherine's voice was icy, filled with menace. "You thought I wouldn't notice? Did you really think you could outsmart me?" The confrontation they had feared had arrived. The final showdown between mother and wife, between the truth and the lies, was about to unfold. Finally be free of that place. But another part of her was filled with dread. She knew that Catherine and William wouldn't let this go easily. They had already gone to such lengths to control John, to manipulate him, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But for now, Margaret allowed herself a brief moment of peace. Her son was on his way to safety. She squeezed John's hand gently, feeling the frailty of his body, but also the warmth of his grip, a sign that, despite everything, he was still fighting. Olivia glanced at Margaret, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "We're almost there," she said softly. "He'll be in good hands soon. We'll get the analysis done, and once we have that proof, we can go after them. We'll make sure they pay for everything they've done." Margaret nodded, her mind racing through the next steps. The clinic was a safe place for now, but she knew that time was still their enemy. Catherine and William would have resources at their disposal, and they wouldn't rest until they found out what had happened. She couldn't let her guard down, not for a second. As the ambulance sped toward the clinic, Margaret thought of everything she had uncovered: the letters, the forged documents, the financial records, pieces of a puzzle that, when completed, would expose the truth. But they still needed the final piece, the proof of the poisoning. If the analysis came back positive, they would have everything they needed to destroy Catherine and William's plan. But even with the proof, Margaret knew the fight would be far from over. They would need to be strategic, careful. One misstep and John's life could be in danger again. The clinic finally came into view, its sterile exterior a stark contrast to the dark drama they had just left behind. The doors swung open as they pulled in, and a team of medical staff rushed to meet them, ready to take John inside. Margaret stepped out of the ambulance, holding John's hand tightly, her breath shallow with a mix of relief and anxiety. Olivia followed close behind, speaking urgently to the doctors. John was quickly wheeled inside, and Margaret, though still uneasy, allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She watched as John disappeared through the hospital doors, and it was then that she realized just how much she had been holding in. The emotions of the last few days, the fear, the uncertainty, the rage, finally, they began to flood her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back. There was still work to be done. "He's in good hands now," Olivia said, her voice filled with quiet reassurance. "We did it, we got him out." Margaret nodded but didn't speak. She was too focused on the road ahead. She knew they weren't out of danger yet. Catherine and William were going to come after them, and they would do whatever it took to protect their secret. But Margaret's resolve had never been stronger. She would do whatever it took to protect her son. They confirmed that John was poisoned. "We'll have the proof we need to expose Catherine and William for what they've done. But we need to be careful. We can't take any unnecessary risks until we know for sure. They have too much power, and if they find out we're trying to take them down, it could put John in even more danger." Margaret nodded, her thoughts racing. The moment of escape from the mansion had been a victory, but it felt fragile, like it could all come crashing down at any moment. She was still so aware of how much was at stake. Not only her son's life, but the lives of everyone who had helped her, including Olivia and Alfred. "How long will it take to get the results?" Margaret asked, trying to stay focused. Olivia hesitated for a moment. "It could take a few days, but we need to be careful about how we approach it. If Catherine or William get suspicious, we may have to move quickly, even sooner than we think." Margaret sat back, her mind grappling with the weight of their next steps. Even with all the evidence they had collected, the letters, the forged documents, the financial records, none of it would matter without the poisoning proof. That was their final, irrefutable piece of evidence. But as she sat there in the quiet waiting room, the ticking of the clock seemed like a reminder of how little time they had. She glanced toward the door where John had been taken, her heart aching with every second that passed without him by her side. Olivia must have sensed her anxiety, because she took a seat beside her, speaking in a low voice. "Margaret, you've done everything you could to get him out of there, and now we're doing everything we can to save him. I know it's hard, but we need to take this step by step." Margaret forced herself to take a deep breath. She couldn't afford to break now, not when John needed her most. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice steadying. I just want him safe." Olivia gave her a reassuring smile. "We're going to get him through this. We just need to be smart and patient." The next few days passed in a blur of medical care and tense waiting. John remained in the clinic under close observation, and although his condition stabilized, it was clear that the damage done to his body by the poisoning had taken a toll. Margaret remained by his side as much as possible, finding comfort in his small but significant improvements. Meanwhile, Olivia kept in contact with the trusted doctor, who was analyzing the medication samples. Every day, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavier on Margaret. What if the tests didn't provide the proof they needed? What if Catherine and William had already covered their tracks? But Olivia's confidence helped keep her grounded. It'll take time, but we'll get the results. Once we have them, we can act. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Olivia returned to Margaret with the news. "We have the results," she said, her voice serious but determined. "The tests confirm that John was indeed poisoned. It's a slow-acting toxin, but it matches the symptoms we've been seeing. We've got them." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The proof they had been waiting for was finally in their hands. But now came the hard part, exposing Catherine and William. "How do we proceed?" Margaret asked, a mix of relief and anxiety in her voice. Olivia looked at her gravely. "We have everything we need, but we'll need to make sure the authorities can't be swayed by Catherine's influence. We'll have to be smart about it, or John won't be the only one in danger." Margaret knew Olivia was right. The authorities would need to be presented with the evidence in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed or ignored. But now, she had the courage to face whatever was ahead. For John, she would fight. "Let's do it," Margaret said, her voice filled with renewed determination. "We'll take them down." His sharp eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of trouble. He noticed the same unusual quietness, the absence of the usual buzz of staff moving about, the lack of footsteps echoing in the hallways. Something was off. Catherine entered the mansion, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. The house was eerily still, as if the entire staff had vanished. She immediately headed toward John's room, expecting him to be in bed where she had left him earlier that morning. But as she approached the door, a chill ran down her spine. The door was slightly ajar, the room disturbingly empty. "Where is he?" Catherine demanded, her voice sharp as a blade. She pushed the door open fully and scanned the room, finding nothing amiss, except for one glaring detail. John's bed was untouched, the linens undisturbed. William stepped up beside her, his expression unreadable. He had also noticed the unsettling quiet. "Do you think he's gone?" he asked, a flicker of concern in his voice. Catherine's eyes narrowed as she stepped further into the room, glancing around as if expecting John to materialize from the shadows. "No," she muttered to herself. "He wouldn't have been able to move on his own. Someone took him." Her mind raced as she thought of every possible person who might have been involved. Olivia was the first name that came to her mind. The nurse had become increasingly suspicious over the past few days, and Catherine was certain that if anyone had helped John escape, it would be her. "Find them," Catherine ordered coldly, her voice low with barely restrained fury. "Alfred, Olivia, and anyone else who might have helped. They'll pay for this." William nodded, immediately going to the nearest intercom to summon the guards. His calm demeanor masked the tension that was building in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that this had all been planned long before they had even suspected anything. Someone had outsmarted them. Catherine stood in the middle of John's room, her fingers tightening into fists. "They think they've won," she whispered to herself, "but this is only the beginning." Meanwhile, across town, Margaret was sitting in the clinic's waiting room, her thoughts consumed with the next steps. She knew that once Catherine and William realized John was gone, they would stop at nothing to get him back. But for now, they were safe. As the hours passed, Olivia kept checking on John, making sure that his condition was stable, but she could feel the tension in the air, thick with the knowledge that time was slipping away. "We need to be prepared," Margaret said quietly, her resolve firm. "If Catherine comes after us, we can't let her have John back." Olivia agreed, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I'll make sure John stays safe here, but we'll need to get the authorities involved soon. With the evidence we have, we can expose them. We can't wait too long." Margaret's gaze hardened as she nodded. "No, we can't. Catherine and William may be dangerous, but they underestimated us. We're going to make sure they never hurt John again." Meanwhile, at the mansion, Catherine and William entered John's room with cold precision, expecting to find him lying in bed as they had left him. Instead, the room was empty. The bed unmade, the air thick with the absence of John. "What the hell?" William muttered under his breath, stepping further into the room. His eyes scanned the surroundings, but there was no sign of John. Catherine stood at the threshold, her eyes narrowing as she took in the emptiness. Her heart rate quickened, the realization dawning on her with horrifying clarity. "He's gone," she whispered, more to herself than to William. "Where could he have gone?" William asked, his voice betraying a rare flicker of panic. "He's too weak to move on his own." Catherine clenched her jaw, fury rising inside her like a tidal wave. "Someone helped him. We've been betrayed." The air between them thickened with tension as Catherine's mind began working furiously, piecing together the puzzle. It was Olivia. She's been too quiet, too cooperative. She's the one who helped him escape. William moved quickly to the intercom, his fingers flying over the buttons. "I'll have the guards search the mansion, check every exit, find him." Catherine turned on her heel, her eyes blazing with cold determination. "No, we'll go ourselves. We're going to find John and make sure he pays for this. No one betrays me and gets away with it." Her voice dripped with malice as she spoke, and William, though hesitant, knew better than to argue. Together they began to search the mansion, their eyes sharp, their minds focused on one thing: getting John back, alive or dead. Back at the clinic, the weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing minute. Margaret could feel the pressure mounting, knowing that the storm was coming. Catherine and William would not stop until John was back in their grasp. She paced the hallway, trying to stay calm despite the fear that gripped her. Every instinct screamed that they were running out of time. If Catherine and William found out where John was, there would be no escaping their wrath. Olivia, seeing the worry etched on Margaret's face, stepped forward. "We need to move John again, just in case. If they've figured out where he is, this place won't be safe for long." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's get him out. We'll go to ground. They won't know where to find us." As the two women prepared for John's next move, the clinic, once a haven of quiet refuge, now felt like a ticking time bomb. Every second counted. William muttered under his breath, his hands shaking slightly as he rifled through John's bedsheets and the surrounding area, looking for any hint, any trace that might explain his disappearance. How could he move? He's too weak. Catherine's mind raced. She had been calculating every move, anticipating every possibility, but this was a complete betrayal. Her eyes narrowed as she turned to William, a cold fury beginning to surface. He's not alone in this. Someone helped him. It must have been Olivia. Her voice was steady, but the coldness in her tone sent a chill through the room. William nodded, his own expression darkening. "We need to find them. Now." They both knew what had to be done. Catherine's control had been slipping ever since John's condition worsened, but this was different. This wasn't just a matter of illness. This was an outright act of defiance. Someone had dared to betray her. Catherine spun on her heels and stormed out of the room, William following closely behind, his expression a mix of anger and concern. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. Catherine's unraveling composure is a testament to the depth of her obsession with control. Throughout the narrative, her psychological profile consistently shows a preference for meticulous, strategic planning. Her anger, escalating from frustration to fury, reflects not only her internal collapse but also the magnitude of her loss of power. She relied heavily on the assumption that everything within her domain was predictable, a false security that has now shattered. This episode is crucial in highlighting the vulnerabilities of individuals who rely on calculated control but lack adaptability when confronted with unforeseen events. Margaret, on the other hand, embodies resilience in the face of imminent danger. While her initial response to John's condition and the manipulations around him was reactive, she has now moved into a more proactive stance, understanding the need for both strategic timing and caution. Her shift from despair to determination reveals an acute awareness of the stakes at hand. The clinic, a temporary safe haven, represents a pivotal stage in her efforts not just to protect John physically, but to counteract the increasingly dangerous machinations of Catherine and William. This dynamic between Catherine and Margaret also highlights a critical aspect of strategic conflict. the tension between control and flexibility. Catherine's reliance on rigid control mechanisms is now proving to be her greatest weakness, whereas Margaret's adaptability in the face of adversity is starting to turn the tide. The fact that she has both evidence and a plan, while Catherine's foundation is cracking, positions Margaret in a stronger light, at least for the moment. However, the true challenge lies ahead. While Margaret has successfully navigated the initial phase of escape and securing John's safety, the next steps will require precision. The complexity of their situation cannot be overstated. While Margaret's actions are necessary, they are also fraught with risk. The clandestine movement of John and the acquisition of medical evidence are vital, yet each step brings them closer to the inevitable confrontation with Catherine and William, who will stop at nothing to regain control. For Margaret, the current strategy is to buy time ensuring John's continued recovery while staying one step ahead of her pursuers. This is where psychological and tactical considerations must align. The ability to anticipate Catherine's actions and reactions will be just as important as the physical movements of John. Here it's not just a matter of escape, but a careful orchestration of every move to ensure they are not cornered before they can expose the full extent of Catherine and William's treachery. Moving forward, Margaret will need to continually assess the evolving landscape of threats, using not only the evidence she's gathered, but also her understanding of Catherine's psyche. Catherine's obsessive need for control and her failure to maintain that control will be her undoing. This is a chink in her armor Margaret can exploit. The next steps will be critical in ensuring John's recovery and ultimately bringing Catherine's criminal actions to light. The quiet stillness of the clinic contrasted sharply with the turmoil that churned in Margaret's heart. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a reminder that John still had a chance, but the situation remained precarious. As she sat there, her thoughts turned over the battle that lay ahead. She had fought to get John out of the mansion, but now she faced an even greater challenge, exposing the truth, bringing Catherine and William to justice, and securing her son's future. Olivia's presence by John's side was a comfort, but Margaret knew it was just a brief respite. She had to be ready for the storm that would surely come once Catherine and William realized their prize was no longer in their grasp. The thought of facing Catherine again, knowing how ruthless and calculating she was, made Margaret's heart race. But she reminded herself of the power she had: her love for John, her determination, and the evidence she now possessed. She had the upper hand, but only if she played her cards carefully. Olivia spoke quietly, her voice bringing Margaret back to the present moment. "We need to prepare, Margaret. If Catherine comes for him, we can't let her succeed." Margaret nodded, her grip tightening on John's hand. "I won't let her take him again, I swear it." The words were filled with a quiet fury, a promise made not just to John but to herself. She had spent too long being passive, believing the lies Catherine had woven. Now, she would be the one who controlled the narrative. She would make sure John's legacy and life were protected. The pieces were coming together. The poisoning was a critical element, but the financial records were just as damning. With the right medical analysis and the authorities on their side, they could prove that Catherine and William's entire scheme was built on manipulation and greed. But they still had to stay one step ahead, ensuring that Catherine never learned of their plans before it was too late. The day wore on slowly. Every passing moment was another opportunity for the conspirators to catch up, and yet it was also one more chance for John to heal, to fight for his life. Margaret spent every minute in the clinic focusing on him, comforting him, willing him to recover, and yet in the back of her mind, she prepared for what came next. Her mind raced through every possibility, considering how she could leverage the evidence to expose Catherine and William without alerting them too soon. But above all, she knew they had to be careful. Rushing into a confrontation could mean losing everything they had worked for. Every step needed to be calculated, just as Catherine had done with her plans to destroy John. Later that day, Alfred made an unexpected visit to the clinic. He arrived under the pretense of checking in on Margaret and John's well-being, but Margaret knew there was more to it. Alfred had always been loyal to the family, but his role had become more complex as the stakes had risen. He had helped in John's escape, but Margaret had no illusions about the danger he faced. She greeted him warily, her heart not trusting anyone too easily now. "I wanted to check on you, Mum," Alfred said, his tone as neutral as ever. "Is there anything you need, any help I can provide?" Margaret studied him carefully. There was no outward sign of guilt, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in the middle of a far deeper conspiracy than she'd initially realized. "I'm fine, Alfred. Just make sure you're ready for whatever comes next. We need every advantage we can get." He nodded, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Of course, ma'am, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." As he left, Margaret couldn't help but feel a twinge of uncertainty. Was he truly on their side? Or was he just another pawn in Catherine and William's twisted game? She pushed the thought aside. She couldn't afford to doubt anyone now. She had a son to save. By nightfall, the first signs of Catherine's fury began to surface. Alfred had returned to the mansion, but Margaret knew that the chaos was about to unfold. Time was running out, and they needed to act quickly. The storm was coming, and Margaret could only pray that they were prepared for what would come next. The battle was no longer about survival, it was about justice, and she would stop at nothing to ensure John's safety, no matter the cost. Cold chill ran down her spine as the weight of the words sank in. The evidence was irrefutable. John had been systematically poisoned. The meticulous cruelty of it all sent waves of rage and sorrow coursing through her. Catherine's cold, calculated plan to kill John, to steal his life and legacy, had been unfolding in the shadows. But now there was proof. Margaret swallowed hard, steadying herself. She couldn't afford to break down, not now, not when they were so close to turning the tide. "We have what we need," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Now, we take it to the authorities. It's time to end this." Olivia gave a quick nod, but there was a look of concern in her eyes. "We need to be careful. If Catherine finds out we have this evidence, it will only fuel her desperation. She will stop at nothing to regain control." Margaret nodded in agreement. She knew the danger that lay ahead. If Catherine realized the game was up, she would make a move, and it would be ruthless. But there was no turning back now. The risk of exposing the truth was nothing compared to the risk of leaving John in her hands. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Olivia worked quickly, contacting the trusted medical professionals who would help verify the test results and ensure they had an unassailable case. Margaret made arrangements to meet with the authorities. The evidence they had gathered, the poisoning, the forged contracts, the financial records, would all be crucial in dismantling the conspiracy that had plagued John's life. But as they moved swiftly to put their plan in motion, Margaret couldn't shake the image of Catherine. The woman who had once been so close to John, so carefully orchestrated in her facade of care and affection, now revealed herself as the heartless schemer she truly was. The thought of facing Catherine again, of confronting her with the full scope of her betrayal, was daunting. But Margaret knew that the time had come to stop being afraid. Meanwhile, Catherine and William had no idea that their world was crumbling. Alfred had done his best to keep them distracted, but Margaret knew they would soon realize John was no longer in the mansion. The chaos they would unleash would be immense, but she would be ready for it. She had to be. The calm before the storm had passed. With the proof in hand, the next move would be critical. Margaret was prepared to fight with everything she had, knowing that John's life and future depended on her unwavering resolve. The game was no longer about survival. It was about justice, and she would see it through to the end, no matter what it took. Would come crashing down. Catherine's mind raced with panic and rage, each thought a desperate plan to regain control. She paced the halls of the mansion, her steps sharp and quick, as if walking through a maze of her own making. William was by her side, trying to stay composed, but even he couldn't ignore the tension that had settled like a heavy fog over them both. "We have to find him," Catherine said, her voice dangerously calm, despite the fury that simmered just beneath the surface. "John can't be allowed to recover. Not now, not when everything is at risk." William, his face set in a grim expression, nodded. "We'll find him. And when we do, we'll make sure no one believes his story. He's too weak to be a threat. But if the authorities get involved? Catherine's voice trailed off, her mind calculating the worst-case scenario. We can't let that happen. The poison, it'll all come back to us. They'll see through everything. We'll be exposed. William was silent for a moment, his own concerns mirrored in Catherine's eyes. The plans they'd made for years, the careful steps they'd taken to control John and his fortune, were now unraveling. A new, unpredictable factor had entered the equation, Margaret, and she was dangerous. "She'll fight us," William said, his tone firm, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. "She already has the evidence. She knows everything." Catherine's lips curled into a cold smile, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter taste of contempt. "Let her try. She won't win. We've been playing this game for too long. If Margaret thinks she's going to take John from us, she's deluded." Meanwhile, in the clinic, Margaret's mind was set. She had everything she needed to expose the truth, but time was quickly slipping away. She knew that the authorities needed to act fast, but Catherine and William's influence ran deep. They had the power to manipulate the situation, to twist it to their advantage. Olivia was already preparing the paperwork, the medical evidence, and the financial documents. "We need to file everything now," she urged. "It's the only way to ensure the authorities act before they can counter us." Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. The final confrontation was coming. The calm she'd felt earlier had shifted, replaced with a cold resolve. She had no illusions about what would happen when Catherine and William found out about John's escape and the evidence Margaret had gathered. It would be war, and no matter how much Catherine fought to protect herself, Margaret would not let her son fall back into their hands. "I'm ready," Margaret said, the finality in her voice making it clear that there was no turning back. "Let's do this. Let's make sure they can't hurt John anymore." As they prepared to go to the authorities, every step felt like it could be their last chance. The final showdown was inevitable, and Margaret knew that when it came, she would not falter. Catherine had underestimated her strength, and now she would pay for her cruelty. Back at the mansion, Catherine and William were already setting their own plans into motion, determined to take back control of the situation. But this time, they were up against a mother's unbreakable will, and there was no force in the world strong enough to stop it. "Undermine our family, to destroy everything we've built. We need to turn the tables, make her the villain." William's tone was calculated, his mind already working on a strategy that could shift the narrative in their favor. Catherine, though seething with frustration, listened carefully. William's ability to remain composed, even in the face of disaster, was something she both admired and despised. She knew he was right. If they acted quickly, they could still prevent John's poisoning from becoming public knowledge. If they could control the narrative, discredit Margaret and her evidence, they might have a chance to regain control over the situation. "How do you suggest we do that?" Catherine asked, her voice sharp and eager for a plan. William leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "We need to get to the authorities before they get to us. If we can plant the idea that Margaret is using John to leverage a personal vendetta, we can discredit the poisoning claim. We'll have to manipulate the right people, plant some doubts about the authenticity of the evidence, and accuse Margaret of attempting to frame us." Catherine's eyes narrowed as she processed the plan. It was risky, but if executed properly, it could turn everything in their favor. "And the clinic?" she asked, her mind already racing with the next piece of the puzzle. "What if they find out where John is?" William gave a tight smile. "We'll make sure they never find out. A little bribery, a few well-placed favors, and we'll have the clinic on our side. They'll say nothing. They'll protect our interests." Catherine's rage simmered down as she considered their options. For the first time in days, she felt a sliver of control slip back into her hands. But she also knew that their time was running out. The sooner they acted, the better. "They won't know what hit them," Catherine said with a cold, steely resolve. "Once we have the authorities on our side, we'll crush them." William stood up and walked to the window. his eyes scanning the grounds below. "This isn't just about John anymore," he said, his voice low and steady. "If we lose, it's everything. Our reputation, our legacy. This is the final battle. We have to win, no matter what." Back at the clinic, Margaret's heart raced as she, Olivia, and the doctors made their final preparations to take the evidence to the authorities. The tests had confirmed what they feared, and it was only a matter of time before Catherine and William realized John was no longer under their control. Every minute that passed felt like a countdown, each tick bringing them closer to a confrontation they couldn't avoid. As Margaret sat by John's bedside, staring at his fragile form, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was closing in. The evidence they had could destroy Catherine and William, but Margaret knew that once the authorities were involved, there was no turning back. It would be a war, one that would take everything they had to win. "We're ready," Olivia said quietly, stepping into the room with a folder full of documents. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the tension they all felt. "It's time." Margaret nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had come this far and she couldn't stop now, not when John's life and the truth were finally within reach. As they prepared to leave, the weight of the moment settled over them. The evidence they carried would expose Catherine's cruelty, her manipulation, and her attempt to destroy John. But Margaret knew that even with the proof, the real battle had yet to begin. Outside, the storm clouds were gathering, but Margaret's resolve was unwavering. She would do whatever it took to protect her son and ensure that Catherine's reign of terror came to an end. The game was far from over, and Margaret was ready to fight until the very end. Margaret's heart sank as the weight of the situation settled in. Catherine and William were not only trying to regain control over John, but they were also attempting to turn the entire narrative on its head, painting her as the villain in this twisted game. They knew exactly how to manipulate the situation to their advantage, accusing her of kidnapping, of being a mother desperate to destroy her son's legacy, when all she wanted was to save him. "We need to act fast," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they get to the authorities first, we'll lose everything." Olivia, always the calm strategist, nodded with determination. "We can't let them control the narrative. We have the evidence, and we need to make sure it gets in the right hands before they can discredit us." But the lawyer's words rang in Margaret's ears. Act now. They didn't have time to waste. Every minute they spent trying to plan their next move was a minute Catherine and William could use to entrench their version of events, to manipulate the truth further. Margaret looked down at John, who lay unconscious in the bed beside her, his body still fragile from the poison that had ravaged him. The thought that all of this, his suffering, his near death, was part of Catherine's calculated plot for control, made her blood run cold. "What do we do?" Margaret asked, trying to pull herself together. "We need a strategy. We can't let them twist this into something it's not." Olivia, scanning her phone for updates, turned to face Margaret. "We need to get ahead of them. If we can find a way to expose their corruption and their lies before they can make their accusations stick, we might still have a chance." The sound of Olivia's phone vibrating on the table interrupted their conversation, and she glanced down at the screen. It was the lawyer again. "Margaret," Olivia said, her voice grim, "the authorities have already been notified about the kidnapping accusation. We need to move fast. We need to get the evidence directly into their hands, and fast." Margaret nodded, panic beginning to rise in her chest. They couldn't allow Catherine and William to manipulate the situation any longer. They had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. "We'll go directly to the authorities," Margaret said, standing with a new resolve. "No more delays. If we don't act now, they'll have complete control over John's fate." Just as they were about to leave, there was a knock on the door. Olivia opened it cautiously, revealing a man dressed in plain clothes, one of their trusted contacts. He stepped inside without a word, his eyes immediately scanning the room. "We have to move quickly," he said, his voice low. "Catherine and William have already mobilized. The police may show up here soon. We need to get this evidence to the right people before they can reach the authorities first." Margaret felt a cold wave of dread wash over her, but the drive to protect John and bring the truth to light pushed her forward. They couldn't back down now. They had the proof. They had John's life to save. And most importantly, they had justice on their side. Olivia nodded at their contact. "Let's go. We'll go straight to the police station now." With no time to waste, they rushed out of the clinic, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they entered the waiting vehicle, the atmosphere was heavy with the realization that they were now in the middle of a high-stakes game that would determine not only John's future, but the entire family's fate. Outside, the storm clouds gathered overhead, but Margaret was undeterred. No matter what came next, she would fight for John, for justice, and for the truth. Catherine's once steely composure began to unravel before the judge, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. The courtroom, once tense with uncertainty, was now filled with a hushed reverence for the truth that had finally come to light. The weight of Margaret's evidence, John's medical records, the testimony from experts about the poisoning, and the financial documents that revealed Catherine's and William's corrupt dealings was undeniable. Catherine's attempt to paint herself as the victim had faltered completely in the face of hard, irrefutable proof. The judge's words, cold and final, echoed in her ears. Guilty of attempted murder and financial fraud. For the first time in years, Catherine felt a deep sense of vulnerability. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. The power and control she had held over John, over the mansion, over everything she had manipulated, was slipping away like sand through her fingers. William, who had stood beside her with quiet confidence throughout the proceedings, looked ashen. He hadn't anticipated this. Despite his calm demeanor, he had underestimated the depth of the evidence and the determination of Margaret and Olivia. As the judge ordered their arrest, Catherine's eyes darted around the courtroom, searching for any shred of hope or way to escape. But it was over. The law had spoken, and the truth had triumphed. Margaret, who had stood stoically throughout the trial, now allowed herself a moment of relief. She had done it. They had done it. John would finally be free, and Catherine and William would face the consequences of their actions. Her heart swelled with a quiet pride for the long and difficult journey they had undertaken. Olivia, who had been by her side every step of the way, gave Margaret a reassuring look. The battle had been hard, and it had taken everything they had to get to this point. But they had won. Justice had been served, not just for John, but for all the victims of Catherine and William's greed and manipulation. As the court officers moved to take Catherine and William into custody, Margaret turned to the side, her thoughts already shifting to John. She couldn't wait to see him, healthy, free, and safe from the people who had once controlled his life. There would still be a long road ahead for John's recovery, but the worst was behind them. He was no longer a pawn in his wife's game. The next chapter of John's life and Margaret's would be one of healing, of reclaiming what had been taken, and of ensuring that Catherine and William could never hurt anyone again. And as she walked out of the courtroom, Margaret knew that she had fought for more than just John's life. She had fought for justice, for family, and for the truth. In the end, love and perseverance had won. The dark days when she thought she might lose John forever, when she had been consumed by fear and uncertainty, not knowing if she would ever see him well again. But now, here they were, in this quiet, peaceful setting, where everything felt like it could finally heal. John, sitting inside the small cottage, was resting, but his once ashen face had begun to regain some of its color. The tremors that had once marked his movements were less frequent, and his eyes, once clouded with pain, now seemed brighter. It was a slow recovery, but every small victory felt monumental. Margaret took a deep breath, allowing the cool evening air to fill her lungs. She glanced toward the window where John's faint figure could be seen lying in bed, and a wave of gratitude washed over her. He had fought so hard to survive, and now, slowly but surely, he was finding his way back to health. She couldn't help but feel proud of him, of his resilience in the face of everything he had endured, but she also couldn't shake the lingering anger toward the people who had tried to destroy him. Catherine, William, and their twisted manipulation. The trial had been necessary, but there were still days when the weight of everything they had done felt unbearable. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound from the doorway. Olivia, who had been by her side through all the chaos, stepped out onto the porch. She had been checking in on John regularly, making sure his recovery was on track. "How's he doing?" Margaret asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. "He's sleeping right now," Olivia replied, joining her on the porch. "But the doctors are pleased with his progress. The next few days will be crucial, but we're moving in the right direction." Margaret nodded, her gaze returning to the horizon. She didn't need to say anything more. They both understood the depth of what John had endured. It was a long road to recovery, but at least they could see the path ahead. Olivia sat beside her, and they both fell into a comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting the world in hues of orange and pink. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt rare after all the turmoil. For now it was enough. Margaret knew the world wasn't perfect, that there would always be shadows from the past, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that everything would be okay. John was safe. The battle had been hard, but they had won, and now together they would rebuild. The life that had been taken from them would be restored, piece by piece. Margaret squeezed Olivia's hand, a silent gesture of gratitude. The journey wasn't over yet, but it was a new beginning. A new chapter had begun, and with it, a promise that no matter what happened, they would face it together, and they would protect the future they had fought so hard to secure. Had fueled her determination, a love that had driven her to defy the odds, even when faced with the darkest of moments. It wasn't just about saving John, it was about ensuring he would have the chance to live a life free from the cruelty that had nearly destroyed him. Every choice she had made, every moment of fear, every decision had led them to this place of hope. "I couldn't have done it alone," Margaret said softly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "But you're right, Olivia. My love for him. It gave me the strength to keep going. I couldn't bear the thought of losing him to people who never cared about him the way I do." Olivia sat quietly beside her, understanding more than words could express. They had both fought for John, each in their own way, but it was Margaret's unyielding love that had been the foundation of everything. For a moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of their shared experiences settling between them like a familiar presence. The road to recovery was still long, but with each passing day, John's strength was returning, and so was Margaret's peace of mind. "I'm glad you're here with me," Margaret finally spoke, breaking the silence. "I don't know what I'd have done without you these past few months. You've been more than a nurse. You've been a friend, a lifeline." Olivia placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, offering the kind of quiet support that only someone who had shared such an intimate journey could. "We've both been through so much," she said gently, "and we'll keep going through it together. You don't have to face anything alone." Margaret looked over at John, who was resting comfortably inside the cottage, his body slowly but surely healing from the abuse he had suffered. Her heart swelled with love for him. He wasn't out of danger yet, but he had survived the worst. The worst was over. The thought of their enemies, Catherine and William, now facing the consequences of their actions, brought a flicker of satisfaction, but it was nothing compared to the relief Margaret felt, knowing her son was alive and recovering. Margaret sighed deeply, feeling the weight of everything slowly lifting from her shoulders. I think we can finally begin to heal," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Olivia nodded. "Yes, you've both endured so much, but now it's time to look ahead, not back. The future is still uncertain, but at least you've given John a chance to make it his own." Margaret smiled, the first true smile she had shared in weeks, perhaps months. Her heart was still fragile and her trust had been shattered, but the love for her son was unwavering, and with Olivia by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. Together, they had already won the hardest battle. "Thank you," Margaret whispered once more, a simple but profound expression of her gratitude for everything. Always known him to be. Each day brought new challenges, but also new signs of progress, tiny victories that were monumental in their significance. John's strength was returning, not just physically, but in the resolve he carried in his heart. Margaret watched him with a pride she hadn't been able to express before. The man who had once been confined to a life of manipulation and suffering was slowly reclaiming his independence, his identity, and that was something no one could ever take from him again. John had been through so much, but it was clear he was ready to rebuild, to take back control of his life and his legacy. With each step he took toward recovery, Margaret felt herself healing too. It wasn't just his recovery, it was the healing of their bond, their family, their future. "I know you've been through a lot, John," Margaret said softly one afternoon as she helped him adjust in his bed. "But you've always been strong, and nothing can change that. I'll always be here to help you through it, no matter what." John looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "I know, Mom. I don't think I could have made it without you. You've always been my rock." Margaret smiled, her heart full, and leaned in to kiss his forehead. "And you've always been mine." As the days continued to pass, the pain of the past began to fade, replaced by the certainty of their new beginning. They had overcome the darkest of times, and with each passing day their future seemed brighter. Though the scars of the past would always remain, they were no longer defining who they were. John had reclaimed his life, and Margaret had reclaimed her peace. They had been through hell, but together they had emerged stronger, unbroken, and ready to face whatever the future held together. And the scent of fresh grass filled the air. The sun was warm but not overpowering, and the gentle breeze whispered through the trees. It was a peaceful scene, one that seemed miles away from the chaos they had left behind. Margaret walked slowly beside John, her arm around his waist, offering him the support he still needed. But today, there was a new light in his eyes, a sense of independence returning that had once felt so far out of reach. With each step he took, she saw more of the man he had been before the darkness of the past years had overshadowed him. "I can't believe how much things have changed," John said, his voice steady, though tinged with a sense of wonder. "Not just my health, but everything. It feels like I'm finally getting my life back." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "You are, John. It's not easy, but every day you're getting stronger. I'm so proud of you." They paused for a moment, standing at the top of a small hill looking out over the fields. The landscape stretched out before them in all its quiet beauty, something they had both needed after all the turmoil. John looked down at his mother, a mixture of gratitude and relief in his gaze. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Mom," he said softly, his voice raw with emotion. "Through all of this, you never gave up on me. Even when I couldn't fight, you fought for me." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You never gave up either, John. That's why we're here today." John nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the months of pain and suffering, the slow recovery and the incredible strength his mother had shown throughout it all. But now, as he stood with her in the quiet fields, he realized just how much had changed. The healing was far from over, but it was happening. "I know there's still a long road ahead, but I'm ready to face it," John said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "And I'll face it with you by my side." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. "Always," she said. "We've been through the worst, John. Now we're going to build something better." Together they stood in the peaceful stillness of the countryside, knowing that though their journey had been filled with pain, it had led them to this moment of quiet hope. They had survived, and now they would rebuild side by side, as family and as a team. With the sky above them and the fields stretching out before them, Margaret knew that the future, though uncertain, would always hold a promise as long as they walked it together.